I thought graduation day would be the proudest moment of my life. 3 years of law school at the University of Texas, countless sleepless nights studying constitutional law and criminal procedure, surviving finals that nearly broke me. As I walked across that stage in my cap and gown, hearing my name called out over the loudspeaker, I expected to see pride in my parents' eyes. Instead, 30 minutes later, my father Harold looked me dead in the face and said the words that shattered everything I believed about family. "We wish you were never born." The Austin sun beat down mercilessly on the university lawn where families gathered after the ceremony. Graduates posed for pictures with their diplomas while parents beamed with joy and pride. I spotted my family clustered near the oak trees that lined the campus walkway. My mother Susan stood rigidly beside my father, her lips pressed into that familiar thin line that meant trouble. My older brother Jake lounged against the tree trunk, checking his phone with the casual indifference that had characterized our relationship since childhood. I approached them with my diploma case in hand, still wearing my graduation gown. The black polyester fabric stuck to my back in the Texas heat, but I felt confident. At 28 years old, I had finally achieved something significant. Law school had been my dream since high school, and despite my family's constant pressure to join the construction business, I had persevered. "Congratulations, son." Harold's voice carried none of the warmth I had hoped for. His weathered face, tanned from decades of construction work, showed no emotion. Susan nodded curtly, her blonde hair perfectly styled despite the heat, her designer dress pristine and unwrinkled. Jake glanced up from his phone long enough to offer a perfunctory handshake. "Good job, little brother." His tone suggested he was checking an item off a list, rather than celebrating my achievement. Around us, other families embraced and laughed. I watched a girl my age burst into tears as her grandmother pinned a small American flag to her graduation gown. A father lifted his son onto his shoulders while the new graduate's wife took pictures. The joy surrounding us made our family's cold reception even more stark. "I was thinking we could get dinner to celebrate," I suggested, trying to inject some enthusiasm into the conversation. "There's a nice steakhouse downtown." Harold and Susan exchanged a look that I had seen countless times throughout my childhood. It was the look that preceded disappointment, the silent communication that meant I had somehow fallen short of expectations once again. My father cleared his throat. Several other families had gathered nearby, creating an impromptu reception area under the trees. Classmates I had studied with for 3 years mingled with their relatives. Professor Martinez, who had taught my favorite constitutional law class, chatted with students just 10 feet away. That's when Harold decided to detonate the bomb that would change everything. "You want to celebrate?" His voice rose just enough to catch the attention of nearby families. "We wish you were never born. You've been nothing but disappointment your entire life." The words hit me like a physical blow. Conversations around us stopped mid-sentence. Professor Martinez turned to stare. My study group partner Rachel froze with her camera halfway to her face. The family with the small child on shoulders looked over with obvious concern. Susan nodded in agreement, her face set in stone. "Everything would have been so much easier without you." Jake didn't even look up from his phone. The silence stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. I felt the eyes of my classmates, their families, and my professors burning into me. The proudest day of my life had just become my most humiliating. But something strange happened in that moment. Instead of crumbling under the weight of their cruelty, I felt a calm settle over me. 3 years of law school had taught me to think clearly under pressure, to maintain composure when facing hostile opposing counsel. I looked at my parents with steady eyes and spoke clearly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "If that is what you wish, then consider me as if I never existed." I turned and walked away, my graduation gown billowing behind me in the warm Texas breeze. I didn't look back. As I drove through downtown Austin, my mind raced back through 28 years of memories that suddenly made perfect sense. The graduation ceremony, humiliation, wasn't spontaneous cruelty. It was the culmination of a lifetime of calculated psychological warfare. Growing up in the wealthy Preston Hollow neighborhood of Dallas, I had always lived in Jake's shadow. Our house sat on 2 acres of manicured lawn, a testament to the success of Henderson Construction Company that my grandfather had built, and my father had expanded into a multi-million-dollar empire. The company logo, a stylized hammer and blueprint, decorated everything from our mailbox to the spare bedroom that served as Harold's home office. Jake was 3 years older, and everything our parents wanted in a son. By age 15, he was starting quarterback for Highland Park High School, leading the team to 2 state championships. His bedroom walls were covered with football trophies, academic awards, and newspaper clippings celebrating his achievements. Local sports reporters called him the Golden Boy of Highland Park. While Jake dominated the football field, he also excelled in business classes. Even in high school, he would sit at our dinner table, discussing construction contracts and profit margins with Harold. They spoke a language I never understood, filled with terms like cost overruns and municipal bidding processes and subcontractor negotiations. I preferred books to blueprints, debate team to football, constitutional law to construction law. In our family, this made me an oddity at best, a disappointment at worst. Our family dinners followed a predictable pattern. Harold would arrive home from the construction site with dirt still under his fingernails, despite washing his hands. Susan would have prepared an elaborate meal in our formal dining room, complete with her grandmother's china and crystal glasses. Jake would regale them with stories of his latest business triumph or romantic conquest. "Tell them about the Morrison contract," Harold would prompt, his eyes lighting up with pride. Jake would launch into detailed explanations of deals he was negotiating, clients he was courting, properties he was developing. At 25, he had already taken over daily operations of Henderson Construction, while Harold focused on strategic planning and major client relationships. When conversation turned to me, the tone shifted dramatically. "Gage, your brother closed a $2 million deal this week," Susan would say, her voice carrying an edge of accusation. "What exactly are you doing with your life?" During my undergraduate years at UT, I would try to share my academic achievements. Dean's List, debate team victories, internships with local law firms. Harold would listen with barely concealed impatience. "That's nice, son, but when are you going to do something practical? Jake's already making more money than most people see in a lifetime." The comparisons were constant and devastating. Jake drove a brand new BMW that Harold had bought for his 21st birthday. When I turned 21, my parents gave me a gift card to a bookstore. Jake lived in a luxury apartment downtown that the family business paid for. During law school, I worked 20 hours a week at a campus coffee shop to make rent on my studio apartment. Jake brought home a steady stream of beautiful girlfriends who charmed our parents with their perfect smiles and polite conversation. I dated occasionally, but never brought anyone home after Susan made snide comments about my first girlfriend's modest background and limited prospects. The psychological manipulation was subtle, but relentless. Harold would schedule important family events during my law school finals, then express disappointment when I couldn't attend. Susan would forget to invite me to family celebrations, then act surprised when I pointed out the oversight. "We assumed you were too busy with your studies," she would say with false sweetness. They never asked about my grades, my internships, or my career plans. When I mentioned potentially specializing in constitutional law, Harold laughed out loud. "Constitutional law? What kind of money is there in that? Jake's making more in a month than most lawyers make in a year." My extended family received regular updates about Jake's successes, but rarely heard about my achievements. At Christmas gatherings, Harold would spend an hour describing Jake's latest business ventures, while I sat silently at the kids' table, despite being in my 20s. The most painful realization was that my parents had never intended for me to succeed. They wanted Jake to inherit the family business, but they needed me to fail spectacularly enough that no one would question the decision. During my final year of law school, their hostility intensified. When I mentioned graduating with honors, Susan changed the subject. When I received a job offer from a prestigious Austin law firm, Harold barely acknowledged the news. "That's nice," he said without looking up from his newspaper. "Jake's expanding into commercial real estate." I began to suspect that my graduation ceremony appearance was orchestrated. Harold and Susan had driven down from Dallas specifically for the event, which was unusual. They typically avoided my school functions, claiming they were too busy with Jake's business obligations. Jake's presence was particularly suspicious. He had never attended any of my academic events, claiming he was too busy with work. Yet suddenly he had cleared his schedule for a Tuesday afternoon law school graduation in Austin. As I sat in traffic on I-35, replaying the last 3 years of subtle sabotage and outright hostility, I realized the truth that would soon become undeniably clear. The graduation day attack wasn't emotional spontaneity. It was a calculated strike designed to drive me away from the family permanently. They wanted me gone. But why? My phone buzzed with an incoming call. Jake's name appeared on the screen. I turned off the phone and drove toward downtown Austin, where I would soon discover that my family's cruelty had just cost them everything they had worked to achieve. I found sanctuary in Mozart's Coffee Roasters, a quirky coffee house on Lake Austin that had been my study retreat throughout law school. The eclectic mix of outdoor seating, live music, and strong coffee had provided refuge during countless stressful nights of legal research and exam preparation. I ordered a large black coffee and claimed a table overlooking the lake, finally allowing myself to process what had just happened. The graduation ceremony felt like a lifetime ago. Though barely an hour had passed, I pulled my phone from my jacket pocket, noting 17 missed calls and a growing list of text messages. Without reading them, I powered off the device completely. Whatever crisis was developing back at the university, I wasn't ready to engage. Meanwhile, chaos was erupting at the graduation party I had left behind. Jake had spent the first 10 minutes after my departure making jokes about my dramatic exit. Gage always was too sensitive. He told the lingering relatives and family friends who had witnessed the confrontation, "Hell, get over it." But as the minutes ticked by, Jake's casual confidence began to crack. He approached Harold and Susan, who were fielding awkward questions from other parents about the public humiliation they had just inflicted on their younger son. "Where's Gage?" Jake asked, checking his watch. "We need to find him." Harold waved dismissively. "Hez, probably sulking somewhere. Hell, come home when he gets hungry." "No, Dad. You don't understand." Jake's voice carried an urgency that made nearby family members turn to listen. "He was supposed to sign papers today. Important papers." Susan's perfectly composed facade began to crack. "What papers?" Jake pulled Harold aside, speaking in hushed tones that nevertheless carried to Aunt Patricia, Harold's sister, who had driven down from Houston specifically for the graduation ceremony. Patricia had always been fond of me, often questioning my parents' obvious favoritism toward Jake. "The inheritance transfer documents," Jake hissed. "He was supposed to sign them after graduation. The Morrison development deal closes Monday morning. Without his signature, I can't access the inheritance funds." Harold's face went pale beneath his construction site tan. "How much money are we talking about?" $50 million, Jake replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "The entire Morrison acquisition depends on those funds." The Morrison Development Company owned prime commercial real estate throughout East Texas. Jake had been negotiating to purchase the company for 8 months, positioning Henderson Construction to expand from residential work into large-scale commercial development. The deal would triple their annual revenue and establish Jake as one of the youngest major developers in the state. But the acquisition required significant capital investment, money that came from the inheritance our grandmother had left equally to Jake and me. According to the legal documents, either brother could transfer his inheritance rights to the other with proper documentation and notarization. Jake's business plan had always assumed I would willingly sign away my inheritance. Why would a lawyer need money when Jake could build an empire with it? Harold and Susan had spent months softening me up for the request, making it clear that my financial future lay outside the family business. Now, with 30 minutes gone and my phone apparently turned off, the carefully constructed plan was collapsing in real time. "Call him," Susan demanded, her voice sharp with panic. Jake dialed my number repeatedly, each call going straight to voicemail. His business partners, Trevor Walsh and Michael Chen from Davidson Investment Group, were waiting at Jake's downtown office with contracts and lawyers, expecting to finalize paperwork by 5 o'clock. 32 missed calls, Jake announced after his latest attempt. His phone's off. Aunt Patricia, who had been listening to the increasingly frantic conversation, stepped forward with barely concealed anger. "Let me understand this correctly," she said, her voice carrying the authority of a retired high school principal. "You publicly humiliated Gage on his graduation day because you needed him to sign over his inheritance." Harold attempted damage control. "Patricia, you don't understand the complexities involved." "I understand perfectly," Patricia replied, her eyes blazing. "I watched you destroy that boy's confidence for 28 years, and today I watched you try to break his spirit completely. All for money." Other family members began to gather, drawn by the rising tension. Uncle William, Harold's brother who had flown in from Denver, listened with growing concern as the truth emerged. Jake's desperation was becoming obvious to everyone present. "We need to find him," Jake repeated, checking his watch obsessively. "The contracts have to be signed by Friday to meet the Monday closing deadline." "What contracts?" Aunt Patricia demanded. Jake reluctantly explained the Morrison development acquisition, the inheritance transfer requirements, and the $50 million timeline that was rapidly approaching. With each detail, the family's understanding of the graduation day attack became clearer. "You planned this," Patricia accused, pointing at Harold and Susan. "You orchestrated this entire confrontation to manipulate him into signing away his inheritance." Susan's carefully maintained composure finally cracked. "We needed him to understand his place in this family." "His place?" Patricia's voice rose loud enough to draw stares from other families still celebrating nearby. "His place is as an equal member of this family, not as some sacrifice to your golden boy's business ambitions." Uncle William shook his head in disgust. "Harold, what have you done?" As word spread among the extended family about the inheritance, manipulation, and the business deal hanging in the balance, Jake's panic intensified. He called Trevor Walsh to explain the delay. "We can't locate one of the signatories," Jake said into his phone, walking away from the family confrontation. "I need until tomorrow morning." Trevor's response was apparently not encouraging. Jake's face grew pale as he listened to his business partner's concerns about the timeline and the investors' expectations. "No, don't call the investors yet," Jake said quickly. "I'll have the documents signed by tomorrow evening." But as the sun began to set over the university campus and my phone remained unreachable, Jake's confidence in that promise was evaporating rapidly. The graduation party that was supposed to end with a family celebration and a signed inheritance transfer had become a disaster that threatened to destroy everything Jake had spent 3 years building. Aunt Patricia approached Harold one final time as the family began to disperse. "That boy graduated with honors from one of the best law schools in the country," she said quietly. "He's brilliant, kind, and decent despite everything you've done to undermine him. And you just threw him away for money." Harold stared across the campus lawn where other families were still taking pictures and making dinner plans. "We can fix this," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Can you?" Patricia asked. "After what you said to him today, after a lifetime of making him feel worthless, do you really think he's going to help you now?" That question would haunt Harold throughout the sleepless night ahead, as Jake's business empire hung in the balance and my phone remained ominously silent. I returned home near midnight to find every light in the house blazing and 3 cars in our circular driveway. Jake's BMW sat next to Harold's construction company truck, while a silver Mercedes I didn't recognize was parked near our front door. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows of our formal living room, I could see my family in animated conversation with a man in an expensive suit. The moment I walked through the front door, the conversation stopped abruptly. Jake jumped up from the leather sofa where he had been sitting across from the stranger, relief flooding his face. "Gage. Thank God. We need to talk." Harold and Susan sat rigidly in matching armchairs, their earlier confidence replaced by obvious anxiety. The stranger rose from his position near the fireplace, extending a manicured hand. "Mr. Henderson, I'm David Walsh, the family attorney. Your parents have explained the situation." I ignored his outstretched hand, focusing instead on Jake's desperate expression. "What situation would that be?" "The inheritance documents," Jake said quickly. "I know today got heated, but we can work this out. You just need to sign a few papers, and everyone gets what they want." I walked to the bar cart in the corner of the room and poured myself 3 fingers of Harold's expensive whiskey, taking my time to process the scene. 3 of the most important people in Jake's life were assembled at midnight, suggesting this wasn't a casual family discussion. "Tell me about these papers," I said, settling into the chair farthest from the group. David Walsh opened his leather briefcase and withdrew a stack of documents. "Your grandmothers will left equal inheritance to both you and your brother. However, the will includes provisions allowing either beneficiary to transfer their rights to the other through proper legal documentation." "How much money are we discussing?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew. "Approximately $40 million, Walsh replied. "Your portion represents Jake's ability to complete a significant business acquisition." The number hit me like a physical blow, despite my suspicions. $40 million. I had been living in a studio apartment, working at a coffee shop, eating ramen noodles to save money, while sitting on an inheritance worth $40 million that my parents had never mentioned. Interesting, I said, taking a slow sip of whiskey. And when exactly were you planning to tell me about this inheritance? Uncomfortable glances passed between Harold, Susan, and Jake. Walsh cleared his throat professionally. The inheritance was structured as a trust fund with specific release conditions. Your grandmother wanted both grandsons to complete their education before accessing the funds, but Jake's been using his portion to fund his business for years, I observed. I've seen the expansion, the new equipment, the luxury apartment. More uncomfortable silence. Jake leaned forward, his salesman instincts taking over. Look, Gage, you're a lawyer now. You don't need construction money. I can make this inheritance worth twice as much through smart investments and business growth. Everyone wins. Everyone wins, I repeated slowly. Except I lose $40 million. You gain a successful family business that supports everyone. Susan interjected, speaking for the first time since I had arrived. Jake has already proven he can manage the financial responsibilities. I stood and walked to the fireplace mantel, where family photos documented our childhood. Every image told the same story. Jake front and center, me relegated to the background. Even our family portraits had been arranged to emphasize Jake's importance. Tell me about grandmother's original will, I said, still studying the photos. Walsh shifted uncomfortably. I'm not sure what you mean. I mean the will she wrote before someone convinced her to change it. The one that didn't require me to transfer my inheritance to my brother. The silence that followed confirmed my suspicion. I turned to face the room, noting the guilty expressions on every face. There was an original will, wasn't there? Harold finally spoke, his voice lacking its usual authority. Your grandmother was elderly, Gage. She didn't understand the complexities of business management. So you helped her understand, I said. How exactly did you do that? Walsh looked increasingly uncomfortable as he realized the conversation was heading toward potentially illegal territory. Mr. Henderson, I should advise you that these questions may venture into areas requiring legal privilege. I'm a lawyer now, I reminded him. I understand legal privilege perfectly. I walked back to my chair and sat down, fixing Harold with a steady gaze. Tell me about the day grandmother changed her will. She was 92 years old, Susan said defensively. She barely recognized us most days, but she was competent enough to change a $40 million inheritance, I observed. Jake stood up abruptly. This is pointless. The will exists as written. The inheritance can be transferred through these documents. Let's just get this done. No, I said firmly. I want to understand exactly how my own family has manipulated me for 28 years. The truth emerged slowly, painfully, like an infected wound being lanced. Grandmother's original will had left everything to me. She had seen Jake's privileged position in the family and wanted to balance the scales. But Harold and Susan had other plans. They spent months visiting grandmother in her assisted living facility, gradually convincing her that Jake needed the money more because he was the business-minded grandson. They brought documents showing Jake's expansion plans, his employee payroll, his responsibility for multiple families' livelihoods. She wanted what was best for the family, Harold said weakly. She was manipulated by her own son, I replied. And now you're trying to manipulate me the same way. Walsh began gathering his papers. Perhaps we should schedule another meeting when emotions aren't running so high. No, I said sharply. We're going to finish this conversation tonight. I looked around the room at the three people who had shaped my entire life, finally understanding the depth of their psychological warfare. Every put-down, every comparison, every moment of feeling inadequate had been calculated to make this moment possible. You spent years making me believe I wasn't good enough, that I didn't deserve respect or success, that I should be grateful for whatever scraps you threw me. Also, I would willingly give up $40 million. Jake's desperation was becoming obvious. Gage, the Morrison deal closes Monday. I've got investors, contractors, employees depending on this acquisition. Then you should have treated me with basic human decency, I replied. The realization hit Harold and Susan simultaneously. Their years of manipulation had backfired catastrophically. Instead of creating a weak, compliant son who would gratefully transfer his inheritance, they had created a lawyer with knowledge, resources, and a deep understanding of their psychological games. "What do you want?" Susan asked quietly. For the first time in my life, I held all the cards. My family needed something from me, and I finally had the power to set the terms of our relationship. The question was, what would I do with it? Sunday morning found me sitting across from Professor Elizabeth Stanford in her book-lined office at the University of Texas Law School. Professor Stanford had mentored me throughout law school, particularly during my constitutional law studies, and had become someone I trusted for both legal and personal advice. Her silver hair was pulled back in its characteristic bun, and her sharp blue eyes studied the documents I had spread across her mahogany desk. "This is deeply troubling," she said after reviewing David Walsh's inheritance transfer papers. These documents raised several red flags from a legal standpoint. I had called her early that morning, explaining the graduation day confrontation and the midnight meeting with my family. Professor Stanford had immediately agreed to meet, even on a weekend, sensing the urgency of the situation. "What kind of red flags?" I asked, though my legal training was already pointing toward the same concerns. "First, the timeline suggests coercion," Professor Stanford explained, adjusting her reading glasses. "Your family attempted to create a crisis situation where you would feel pressured to sign immediately. Second, the fact that you were never informed of your inheritance until they needed your signature suggests intentional concealment." She turned to her computer and began pulling up legal databases. "More concerning is this documentation about your grandmother's will change. If she was suffering from any form of cognitive decline when the amendments were made, we could be looking at elder abuse." The term hit me like a cold slap. Elder abuse. My own parents might have committed elder abuse against my grandmother to steal my inheritance. Professor Stanford made several phone calls while I sat in her office, connecting me with colleagues who specialized in inheritance law and financial fraud. By noon, I had appointments scheduled with 2 different attorneys and a forensic accountant who could examine the family finances. "Gage," Professor Stanford said as she concluded her final call, "I need you to understand something. If your suspicions are correct, this goes far beyond a family disagreement. We could be talking about criminal fraud." The first attorney was Lisa Rodriguez, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who specialized in inheritance disputes. Her downtown Austin office was decorated with diplomas from Harvard Law and certificates from various legal organizations. She listened to my story with growing interest, taking detailed notes about the timeline and the family dynamics. "Tell me about your grandmother's mental state during her final years," Rodriguez said. "She had good days and bad days," I admitted. "But during family visits, she seemed to recognize everyone and could carry on conversations. Who had power of attorney?" "My father." Rodriguez nodded grimly. "That's often where these cases become problematic. People with power of attorney can exert tremendous influence over elderly relatives." She explained the legal process for challenging inheritance documents, the burden of proof required, and the potential criminal implications if fraud was discovered. The process would be lengthy, expensive, and emotionally devastating for my family. "But you have something most inheritance challengers don't," Rodriguez added. "You're a lawyer yourself. You understand the legal system, and you have the knowledge to recognize when something doesn't add up." The forensic accountant, Michael Thompson, occupied a sterile office filled with computer monitors and financial tracking software. He specialized in cases where family members suspected financial abuse of elderly relatives. "The pattern you're describing is unfortunately common," Thompson explained. "Adult children gradually gain control of their parents' finances, then make changes that benefit themselves rather than honoring the parents' true wishes." He outlined the process for examining financial records, including bank statements, legal fees, and any large transfers or changes to estate planning documents. The investigation would trace every dollar that moved through my grandmother's accounts during her final years. "If your father used his influence to change your inheritance, there should be a paper trail," Thompson said. "Financial fraud almost always leaves evidence." By Sunday evening, I had retained both Rodriguez and Thompson to begin investigating my family's financial manipulation. The retainer fees would drain most of my savings, but Professor Stanford had connected me with a legal aid organization that provided support for attorneys pursuing justice in inheritance fraud cases. More importantly, I was beginning to understand the true scope of my family's betrayal. This wasn't just about hurt feelings or family favoritism. If the investigation uncovered criminal fraud, Harold and Susan could face serious legal consequences, including prison time. Jake's business empire was built on fraudulent inheritance money. Every expansion, every acquisition, every success he had achieved was potentially the result of stolen funds. The Morrison development deal that was supposed to close Monday represented the culmination of years of criminal activity. I spent Sunday night researching similar cases, studying legal precedents, and preparing for the battle ahead. My law school training had prepared me for complex litigation, but I had never imagined using those skills against my own family. Monday morning brought fresh perspective and renewed determination. I called Jake's office, knowing he would be frantically trying to manage the Morrison development crisis while searching for ways to reach me. His assistant put me through immediately. "Gage! Thank God! Listen, I know yesterday got emotional, but we can work this out. The Morrison people are flexible on timing if we can just get the paperwork signed today." "Jake," I interrupted, "I need you to understand something. I've retained legal counsel." Silence on the other end of the line. "What kind of legal counsel?" Jake asked finally, his voice noticeably smaller. "The kind that specializes in inheritance fraud and elder abuse," I replied. "We're going to examine every financial transaction involving grandmother's estate for the past 5 years. Gage, you don't understand. The business, the employees, the investors." "I understand perfectly," I said. "Your business is built on stolen money, and your investors are about to find out." I could hear Jake's breathing quicken on the other end of the line. "What do you want?" For the first time since graduation day, I felt a sense of control over my own destiny. My family had spent years making me feel powerless, convincing me that my worth was determined by their approval. Now I had something they needed desperately, and I had the legal knowledge to protect my interests. "I want the truth," I said. "All of it. And then we're going to discuss what justice looks like for 28 years of psychological abuse." The battle lines were drawn. My family had created a lawyer with the skills and determination to fight back. Now, they were about to discover just how formidable an opponent they had made. Tuesday morning arrived with the weight of inevitability. I had spent the previous day coordinating with my legal team, reviewing financial documents, and preparing for what would either be the most important family meeting of our lives or the last conversation we would ever have as a family. I called Harold's office at Henderson Construction and requested a meeting for 10 o'clock sharp. The receptionist, a cheerful woman named Mrs. Patterson, who had known me since childhood, sounded surprised to hear from me using such formal language. "Of course, honey," she said. "Your daddy's been expecting your call." The Henderson Construction offices occupied a sprawling single-story building in the Richardson Business District, 30 minutes north of downtown Dallas. Harold had built the complex himself 15 years earlier, designing it to project success and permanence. The lobby featured photographs of major construction projects, awards from local business organizations, and a large display case containing scale models of buildings the company had constructed. I arrived precisely at 10 o'clock, wearing my best suit and carrying a leather briefcase that contained copies of every document Lisa Rodriguez had prepared. The receptionist ushered me toward Harold's corner office, but I stopped her. "Actually, Mrs. Patterson, I need to use the conference room. This meeting requires space for several people." She looked confused but directed me to the large conference room where Henderson Construction held client meetings and project planning sessions. The room featured a polished oak table that seated 12 people, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the construction yard where equipment and materials were stored. I spent 10 minutes arranging documents and preparing my presentation, while Mrs. Patterson contacted Harold about the venue change. At exactly 10:15, my family began arriving. Harold entered first, his confidence somewhat shaken since our Sunday night conversation. He had traded his usual work clothes for a business suit, apparently recognizing the formal nature of this meeting. Susan followed, her designer outfit perfectly coordinated as always, though stress lines were visible around her eyes. Jake arrived last, accompanied by Trevor Walsh, his business partner from the Morrison development deal. Trevor was a thin man in his 30s with nervous energy and expensive shoes. someone who clearly understood that his financial future hung in the balance. "What's all this about?" Harold asked, gesturing toward my formal setup. "Sit down," I said, remaining standing at the head of the table. "All of you." The authority in my voice surprised even me. For 28 years, I had been the accommodating son, the one who bent to family pressure and accepted whatever treatment they offered. Today, that dynamic shifted permanently. Once everyone was seated, I walked to the conference room door and opened it wide. Aunt Patricia walked in, followed by Uncle William and my cousin Sarah from Houston. They took seats along the side of the table, creating an audience for what was about to unfold. "I didn't realize we were having a family reunion," Jake said nervously. "You're not," I replied. "You're having a reckoning." I moved to the whiteboard that dominated one wall of the conference room and began writing timeline dates. 1995. Grandmother's original will established. 2018. Grandmother begins showing signs of cognitive decline. 2019. Harold gains power of attorney. 2020. Grandmother's will modified to include inheritance transfer provisions. 2022. Grandmother passes away. 2023. Jake begins using inheritance funds for business expansion. This timeline represents 28 years of financial and psychological manipulation. I announced to the room, "Today, we're going to discuss how it ends." I opened my briefcase and distributed copies of documents to everyone at the table. Bank records showing large transfers from grandmother's accounts to Henderson Construction, legal fees paid to David Walsh for multiple will modifications, financial statements showing Jake's business expansion funded entirely by inheritance money that should have been mine. Trevor Walsh studied the documents with growing alarm. As Jake's business partner, he had assumed the Henderson family financing was legitimate. Now he was looking at evidence of potential fraud. "Gage, what exactly are you trying to prove?" Harold asked, his voice carrying less conviction than usual. "I'm proving that you systematically stole my inheritance to fund Jake's business empire," I replied. "The question now is whether you're going to make this right voluntarily or whether I'm going to pursue criminal charges." The word criminal hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Susan's face went pale. Trevor Walsh looked like he wanted to run from the room. Jake stared at the documents as if they might disappear if he concentrated hard enough. "Criminal charges," Susan whispered. I walked back to the whiteboard and wrote a new set of terms: elder abuse, financial fraud, coercion, conspiracy. "My legal team has identified multiple criminal violations in your handling of grandmother's estate," I explained. "Lisa Rodriguez specializes in inheritance fraud cases. Michael Thompson is a forensic accountant who has already found irregularities in grandmother's financial records. Professor Stanford has connected me with the district attorney's office." Uncle William leaned forward, speaking for the first time since entering the room. "Harold, is this true? Did you manipulate Mother's will to benefit Jake, the family patriarch, the man who had controlled our family dynamics for decades, suddenly looked very small sitting at his own conference table? We did what we thought was best for the family business. You did what was best for Jake," Aunt Patricia corrected sharply, "at the expense of your other son." I continued my presentation, outlining the psychological manipulation I had endured throughout my childhood and adolescence, the constant comparisons, the deliberate undermining of my confidence, the systematic exclusion from family business discussions. Everything had been designed to make me feel unworthy of equal treatment. "The graduation day attack was the final step," I explained. "You needed me to feel so worthless, so desperate for family approval, that I would sign away $40 million without question." Trevor Walsh finally spoke up. "Jake, if the inheritance funds were obtained illegally, the Morrison development deal could expose Davidson Investment Group to criminal liability." Jake's carefully constructed world was crumbling in real time. His business partner was already calculating exit strategies. His parents were facing potential prison time. His younger brother, who had always been dismissed as irrelevant, now held enough evidence to destroy everything. "What do you want?" Susan asked quietly, echoing her question from Sunday night. I moved to the final section of the whiteboard and wrote, "Justice. I want a full public acknowledgement of what you've done," I said. "I want complete financial restitution. I want Harold and Susan to undergo psychological counseling to understand the damage they've inflicted. I want Jake to rebuild his business using legitimate funding sources. And if we agree to these terms, Harold asked, then we work together to repair this family. I replied. But if you refuse, I file criminal charges tomorrow morning, and you explain to the Dallas Morning News how Henderson Construction was built on elder abuse and inheritance fraud. The choice was theirs, but for the first time in my life, I held all the power to enforce the consequences. The investigation moved faster than anyone anticipated. By Thursday morning, Lisa Rodriguez had uncovered evidence that transformed my family dispute into a criminal matter that would soon capture local and national media attention. I sat in Rodriguez's office as she spread new documents across her desk, her expression grim with professional concern and personal outrage. "Gage, this is much worse than we initially suspected," she said, pointing to bank records that Michael Thompson had obtained through legal channels. "Your father didn't just influence your grandmother's will changes. He forged her signature on multiple financial documents. The evidence was damning and comprehensive. Thompson's forensic accounting had revealed a pattern of unauthorized transfers from grandmother's accounts to Henderson Construction, all bearing signatures that handwriting experts had determined were fraudulent. Harold had been stealing from his own mother for over 2 years before her death. "How much money are we talking about?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. "Beyond your $40 million inheritance? Another $15 million in direct theft," Rodriguez replied. "Your father used his power of attorney to systematically drain your grandmother's accounts. The total fraud exceeded $55 million. Jake's entire business empire, everything he had achieved, was built on money stolen from our grandmother through forged documents and elder abuse." Rodriguez had already contacted the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. Agent Maria Salazar, a specialist in white-collar criminal cases, was reviewing the evidence with the possibility of federal charges. The case was significant enough to warrant serious attention from law enforcement. "There's something else," Rodriguez continued, her voice taking on an edge of anger. "We found evidence that your parents knew your grandmother was showing signs of dementia when they manipulated her into changing the will. Her medical records showed documented cognitive decline. I felt sick. My own parents had taken advantage of their elderly mother's mental deterioration to steal millions of dollars that should have been distributed equally between their sons. They had committed elder abuse against the woman who raised them." Friday morning brought devastating news for Jake and Harold. Agent Salazar arrived at Henderson Construction with a search warrant, accompanied by IRS investigators and local police. The raid made the afternoon edition of the Dallas Morning News, complete with photographs of federal agents carrying boxes of financial records from the company offices. The headline read, "Local Construction Dynasty Under Investigation for Elder Fraud." I watched the news coverage from my apartment in Austin, feeling a strange mixture of vindication and sadness. This was my family being exposed for criminal behavior, but it was also justice for my grandmother and accountability for 28 years of psychological abuse. Jake's business partners moved quickly to distance themselves from Henderson Construction. Trevor Walsh issued a public statement announcing that Davidson Investment Group was withdrawing from all current and planned projects with the company. The Morrison development deal collapsed completely, taking Jake's expansion plans with it. By Friday evening, Jake was facing bankruptcy. His investors were threatening lawsuits. His employees were updating their resumes. His reputation in the Dallas business community was destroyed overnight. The media attention intensified over the weekend. The story had everything that local news loved: family drama, elder abuse, millions of dollars in fraud, and a successful business empire built on criminal activity. Television crews camped outside the Henderson Construction offices and our family home in Preston Hollow. Sunday morning brought unexpected validation from sources I had never anticipated. Professor Martinez from Constitutional Law called to express his support. Mrs. Patterson from the construction office reached out to tell me she had always suspected something wasn't right about the family finances. Even Jake's former girlfriend Ashley, who had broken up with him 6 months earlier, contacted me to share stories about Jake's behavior that she had found troubling. He always acted like he was entitled to everything. Ashley told me during a phone conversation, like the world owed him success. Now I understand where that attitude came from. The community response was overwhelmingly supportive. People who had known our family for decades expressed shock at Harold and Susan's behavior. Local business leaders distanced themselves from Henderson Construction. The Highland Park Country Club, where my parents had been members for 20 years, quietly suggested they might want to consider other social options. Monday brought the moment I had been waiting for. Agent Salazar called to inform me that federal charges were being filed against Harold, Susan, and Jake. The charges included elder abuse, financial fraud, conspiracy, and money laundering. If convicted, they could face significant prison time. The FBI had also frozen all Henderson Construction assets pending the outcome of the criminal investigation. Jake's luxury apartment, his BMW, even his personal bank accounts were now under federal control. I felt no joy in their destruction, but I felt profound relief that justice was finally being served. My grandmother's memory was being honored. The years of psychological manipulation were being acknowledged publicly. The family dynamics that had crushed my spirit for decades were being exposed for what they truly were. Tuesday afternoon, I received an unexpected phone call from Harold. Gage. His voice was barely above a whisper. "We need to talk." "I think it's a little late for that, Dad. Please. Your mother and I want to see you. We want to explain." I could have hung up. I could have let the criminal justice system run its course without further family contact. But something in Harold's voice, a brokenness I had never heard before, made me agree to one final meeting. We met at a neutral location, a coffee shop in downtown Dallas, far from the media attention that was following our family. Harold and Susan arrived looking older than their years, the stress of potential imprisonment etched in their faces. "We know we can't fix this," Harold said without preamble. "We know we've lost you forever, but we want you to understand why we did it." "You did it for money," I replied. "There's nothing complicated about greed." Susan spoke for the first time, her voice shaking with emotion. "We did it because we were afraid." "Afraid of what?" "Afraid that you were too good for us," she admitted. "You were always smarter, more moral, more principled than the rest of us. We knew that if you inherited that money, you would use it to help people, to make the world better. Jake would use it to build an empire." The admission hit me harder than any anger or accusation could have. My parents had destroyed our family because they recognized I was a better person than they were, and they couldn't bear to see goodness rewarded. "So you tried to crush that goodness," I said quietly. Harold nodded, tears streaming down his weathered face. "We turned you into our enemy because we were too cowardly to become better people ourselves." It was the first honest thing they had said to me in 28 years. Now I had to decide what to do with that honesty. 6 months after that coffee shop meeting, I stood in the lobby of the Henderson Family Justice Center, watching families receive free legal assistance for inheritance disputes, elder abuse cases, and financial fraud matters. The building that once housed Henderson Construction had been transformed into something far more meaningful than a business empire built on stolen money. The criminal cases against my parents and Jake had concluded 3 months earlier. Harold and Susan pleaded guilty to elder abuse and financial fraud, receiving 2 years in federal prison with the possibility of early release contingent on financial restitution and psychological counseling. Jake's charges were reduced in exchange for his cooperation with the investigation and his agreement to liquidate his remaining assets to help fund victim compensation. The federal court had awarded me complete financial restitution, plus damages for psychological harm and legal expenses. The total settlement exceeded $60 million, money that could have funded a lifestyle of luxury and revenge. Instead, I chose a different path. The Henderson Family Justice Center was my answer to 28 years of family trauma. Using the settlement money, I had created a comprehensive legal aid organization that provided free services to families dealing with inheritance fraud, elder abuse, and financial manipulation. The center employed 12 attorneys, 6 social workers, and a full-time counseling staff. Dr. Sarah Roberts, the family therapist I had retained to help our family heal, served as the center's director of counseling services. She had worked with Harold, Susan, Jake, and me throughout the criminal proceedings, helping us understand the psychological patterns that had destroyed our relationships. Families often repeat cycles of abuse without understanding why. Dr. Roberts explained during our first session together, "Your parents were reacting to their own childhood experiences, their own fears and insecurities. That doesn't excuse their behavior, but it helps explain it." The therapy sessions were painful but necessary. Harold and Susan gradually acknowledged the full scope of their psychological manipulation, understanding for the first time how their favoritism and emotional abuse had damaged me. Jake began recognizing his own role in perpetuating family dysfunction, admitting that he had enjoyed his privileged status without questioning whether it was fair or healthy. "I knew what they were doing to you was wrong," Jake admitted during one particularly difficult session. "But it benefited me, so I convinced myself it wasn't my problem." The healing process was slow and sometimes frustrating. There were setbacks, arguments, and moments when I wondered if forgiveness was possible or wise. But Dr. Roberts helped us understand that family recovery required accountability, not just apology. Harold and Susan began serving their prison sentences at a minimum security facility in East Texas. I visited them monthly, not out of obligation, but because I had chosen forgiveness over permanent estrangement. Our conversations were different now. Honest, direct, sometimes uncomfortable, but real in a way they had never been before. "I'm proud of what you've built with the Justice Center," Harold said during one visit. "Your grandmother would be proud too. She's the reason I built it," I replied. Her memory deserved something better than just revenge. Jake had initially struggled with the loss of his business empire and social status. The federal asset seizure had left him with almost nothing, forcing him to confront his own identity without wealth and privilege. He spent 6 months in a deep depression, questioning everything he believed about success and self-worth. But slowly, with Dr. Roberts' guidance and support from extended family members like Aunt Patricia, Jake began rebuilding his life on healthier foundations. He took a job as a project manager with a small construction company, earning a modest salary based on his actual skills rather than inherited privilege. "It's strange," Jake told me during one of our monthly coffee meetings. "For the first time in my life, I'm proud of what I've accomplished because I actually accomplished it myself." The Justice Center had become more successful than I had imagined. We were handling over 200 cases per year, recovering millions of dollars for elderly victims of financial abuse, and providing counseling services for families torn apart by inheritance disputes. Jennifer Walsh from Channel 8 News visited the center regularly to highlight our cases and educate the public about elder abuse warning signs. Her investigative reporting on family financial fraud had earned several journalism awards and had led to state legislative changes strengthening protections for elderly citizens. "What you've created here goes far beyond your own family situation," Jennifer told me during an interview marking the center's 6-month anniversary. "You've turned personal tragedy into community healing." The center had also attracted attention from legal aid organizations across the country. I was invited to speak at conferences about inheritance fraud, family therapy integration with legal services, and restorative justice approaches to white-collar crime. But the most meaningful recognition came from the families we served. Mrs. Margaret Chen, an 86-year-old woman whose son had stolen her retirement savings, sent handwritten thank you notes every month. The Rodriguez family, who had recovered their father's inheritance after years of legal battles, named their newborn daughter after the center's victim advocate. On the anniversary of my law school graduation, I organized a celebration at the Justice Center that brought together my legal team, the counseling staff, several recovered families, and my own family members who were able to attend. Aunt Patricia gave a speech about the importance of choosing healing over hatred. Professor Stanford presented research showing how family-based legal aid services were more effective than traditional individual representation. Dr. Roberts shared statistics about family recovery rates when accountability was combined with therapeutic intervention. Jake spoke about his journey from privileged businessman to convicted criminal to someone trying to rebuild his life with integrity. His voice shook with emotion as he addressed the audience. "My brother could have destroyed our family completely," he said. "Instead, he found a way to save us from ourselves while helping other families avoid our mistakes. That takes a kind of strength I never understood until I lost everything." Harold and Susan were serving their sentences but had been granted permission to submit written statements that Dr. Roberts read aloud. "We are grateful every day that our son chose forgiveness over vengeance," Susan's letter stated. "The Henderson Family Justice Center represents everything we failed to be as parents: compassionate, principled, and dedicated to helping others rather than ourselves." Harold's statement was shorter but equally powerful. "I spent 60 years building a construction company that was torn down in a week because it was built on lies," My son has spent 6 months building something that will last forever because it's built on truth. As the evening concluded, I found myself standing in the center's main lobby, surrounded by photographs of families we had helped and testimonials from people whose lives had been restored through our work. A young woman approached me, someone I didn't recognize from our staff or client families. "Mr. Henderson? I'm Sandra Williams. My grandmother was financially abused by her caregiver, and your center helped us recover her savings and prosecute the person who hurt her." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "I just wanted to thank you. Not just for the legal help, but for showing us that families can heal from terrible things. Your story gave us hope that we could get through our situation." Later that evening, I called Dr. Roberts to debrief the anniversary celebration and discuss plans for expanding our services. "How are you feeling about everything?" she asked, using the therapeutic tone that meant she was checking on my emotional state rather than just making conversation. "Grateful," I said, surprising myself with the answer. "I'm grateful for all of it. The abuse, the betrayal, the investigation, even the pain. All of it led to this. That's remarkable emotional growth," she said. "6 months ago, you were focused primarily on justice and accountability. Now you're talking about gratitude." I thought about her observation as I walked through the center one final time before heading home. The building would be busy again tomorrow, with lawyers meeting clients, counselors facilitating family sessions, and investigators documenting new cases of elder abuse. But tonight, it was quiet and peaceful, filled with the potential for healing that exists when people choose courage over comfort, truth over convenience, and love over revenge. My family had been shattered by greed and deception, then slowly rebuilt through accountability and forgiveness. The process had taken everything I thought I knew about justice, family, and success, and had challenged me to find better answers. The Henderson Family Justice Center was my answer. Not perfect, not complete, but honest and growing, and dedicated to the principle that families could heal from almost anything if they were willing to face the truth together. As I locked the building and walked to my car, I thought about the question that had haunted me since graduation day. What would I do with the power to change everything? I had chosen to use that power to help others find their own path to healing and justice. And in doing so, I had discovered that the best revenge against those who had tried to crush my spirit was to become exactly the person they had feared I might become. Someone strong enough to forgive without forgetting, principled enough to demand accountability without seeking destruction, and wise enough to transform pain into purpose. The question I want to ask you is this: when the people closest to you fail you most deeply, do you believe it's possible to rebuild those relationships on healthier foundations? Have you ever had to choose between justice and revenge? And how did you make that decision? Your experiences and insights matter, and I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please like this video to help others find it who might need hope that families can heal from terrible betrayals. Subscribe to hear more stories about ordinary people finding extraordinary strength in impossible situations. And please, share this with anyone who might benefit from knowing that forgiveness doesn't mean accepting abuse, and that justice can look like transformation rather than destruction. Thank you for listening to my story, and for being part of a community that believes healing is always possible, even in the most broken families. I hope that whatever challenges you're facing with your own family relationships, you'll find the courage to demand better, while leaving room for the possibility that people can change when they're held accountable for their actions. Until next time, remember that your worth is never determined by how others treat you, and that sometimes the greatest victory is helping those who hurt you become better people than they were before.